Well, here we go with lit term review number 4 with the terms figurative language, foil, not the aluminum kind, hyperbole, imagery, and irony. And there are 3 types of irony, believe it or not: verbal, situational, and dramatic, and we're going to cover them all. So let's set them up and knock them down. Here we go. So figurative language, believe it or not, I have to literally explain this, but figurative language is wording that you can't take at face value because it doesn't mean exactly what you say. It's intended to convey an idea, whether it's in poetry, it can be in nonfiction, even fiction, but it's when you actually use language to give a feeling or an idea of what you mean without saying exactly what you mean. And it really is kind of a blanket term, and there's lots of different kinds of figurative language, like metaphor and simile, idioms. Those are all great examples of different kinds of figurative language that you might run across. So figurative language could be an idiom, like that's the pot calling the kettle black, meaning you're accusing someone of doing something you're guilty with, but we're not talking about pots and pans talking to each other. Also could be like a cliche. A cliche is a worn out saying. So something like, he had to walk a mile in my shoes. We don't really mean we want someone to walk in our shoes. So it's not hyperbole, because it's not an exaggeration, but it is this idea where we want someone to experience what we've experienced. So those are some examples of types of figurative language. So a foil is an interesting thing in literature. It's a character that is not necessarily the antagonist, like the enemy of the protagonist, but the character's purpose, the foil's purpose, is to show some contrast to the protagonist or a main character. It shows different qualities than the main character, and the purpose is to highlight the qualities in the protagonist or the initial character that you're talking about. I think a good example of a foil would be the character in Harry Potter of Malfoy. He's not really the main antagonist, although he is an enemy of Harry Potter's, but his sneakiness, his deviousness, his cutting corners serve to contrast more the virtuous characters in Harry himself. For our next word, hyperbole, I think I kind of let the cat out of the bag on this one a little early. Literally, okay, figuratively, when we talked about figurative language. So hyperbole is a deliberate exaggeration in order to prove a point or draw attention to something. Examples of hyperbole. Let's say someone says, "Oh my gosh, I'm freezing to death." Well, that's probably not true. So you would probably want to say something like, "I've told you 1,000,000 times not to exaggerate." There's hyperbole for you. Imagery is the use of descriptive or even some figurative language that you bring in to kind of paint a word picture in someone's mind, to get their senses involved, to kind of draw them into the scene that a piece of literature is describing. So listen to this sentence from Lord of the Flies and the kind of picture that it creates in your mind. "The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground." So lots of descriptions of the whole scene that's going on in front of us, and we get a sense of these 2 boys carrying this pig carcass across a patch of kind of rocky or uneven ground. Irony is saying something where your meaning is actually quite different, even perhaps the opposite, or it could be the outcome of a situation is the opposite of what is expected. It's an ironic situation. Now, there was a song by Alanis Morissette called "Isn't It Ironic?" And one of the running jokes is nothing in that song really was ironic. They were just kind of like unfortunate situations, like 10,000 spoons when all you need is a knife, or the no smoking sign of your cigarette break. Again, that's just unfortunate situations. The irony of the song "Ironic" is that none of the examples of irony are actually irony. So situational irony is when what ends up happening or the end results are opposite of what one would expect or think would actually happen. So for situational irony, if you remember in To Kill a Mockingbird, when Scout went into 1st grade and she already knew how to read, one would expect her teacher to be happy about it. However, the teacher in the book, Miss Caroline, is angry that her father had taught her wrong on how to read. Verbal irony is basically when someone says the opposite of what they really mean or intend. So in a way, sarcasm is kind of like a snarky or vicious verbal irony. So verbal irony can be as simple as saying something like, well, nice going, genius, when you actually mean, well, you blew it, you doof. But think of Pride and Prejudice, which is a great novel. The main character, Darcy, says kind of snottily about the other main character, Elizabeth, that she's not handsome enough to tempt him, when actually he's drawn to her and ends up falling in love with her, which is kind of ironic, specifically verbally ironic. So lastly, dramatic irony, you'd have to think of like in a movie or a play or in a book where you, the reader, actually knows something that the characters do not. So it kind of creates this anticipation or this drama that you know things are going to play out differently than the character expects them to. So for a great example of dramatic irony, think about Romeo and Juliet, if you can go back that far in your memory, if you've read it, that is. And you had Romeo thinking that Juliet had killed herself, and so, oops, he ends up killing himself, and then she wakes up and is like, oh my gosh, what happened? What a mess. That's dramatic irony for you. All right, so that's our review of figurative language, foil, hyperbole, imagery, and 3 types of irony. Hope that helps, and until next time when we cover a couple more lit terms, we'll see you then.